True Detective Night Country episode 4 is over, but here on post show recaps, we are just getting started. My name is Grace, but of course, I'm not alone. I'm here with a very professional podcaster at a very professional network talking about a very professional show. It's Dr. Amanda. Amanda, how you doing?
I'm doing very professionally, Grace. Thank you for asking.
Well,
They're all in the night country now.
yeah, how do you feel about this one? Of just like the show is called True Detective Night Country, like what a cool theme, and they're like they're in the night country, like
It
it's
was
like
it was very
Leo
much,
pointing at the
yeah,
screen.
exactly. It was the Leonardo DiCaprio meme. It always tickles me when a character says the name
I love it.
of a
I do like
thing.
it.
It's like
Yeah,
very silly. I
yeah.
wonder if when they're writing it, they know it's silly or they think it's cool. It's like a little cool, a little bit silly. But we got the titular night country
Yeah.
named. Now we know the great mystery of why this was called True Detective Night Country.
We've solved all the mysteries. I don't even know why we need 2 more episodes, really. Um, I love the deleted scene where he says, "You're a true detective from the night country." No, he didn't say that. Otis
They're all
doesn't
in
say
the
that.
night country, and you, my friend, are a
A
true
true
detective.
detective. Yeah. All right, we're gonna talk about episode 4 of True Detective Night Country. Make sure you subscribe, postyourrecaps.com/true detective or postyourrecaps.com/subscribe. And make sure you don't miss Jess and I will be chatting, doing a deep dive. I believe we'll have a guest. Last week, Sarah Carradine joined us and had a very wild prediction about what happened. You should listen to it to find
No,
out.
I did. Isn't it like a sex party?
That's right.
Some
That's
yes,
official prediction is
I think
that
it was a
it was
spanky, a
it was
spanky.
all just a sex orgy. So that's the
Uh-huh.
prediction. If she gets it right, then she gets 4 points. So we shall see. Mike
Wow.
Bloom and LaTonya Starks also doing the Versus pod comparing season 1 to season 4. Um, all right. So what did you make of this episode, Amanda?
So again, like I think this episode felt packed with a lot. I am increasingly like I'm continuing to be impressed with how much this show manages to pack within an hour in terms of plot. We're introduced to a whole new character
Sure.
again, with Otis Heiss. Um and we also have like this, big development in Navarro's life with the death of her sister.
Yeah.
We get some more insight into the case, of course. This felt like, again, this was moving a lot of pieces down the road. Probably not my favorite episode, but a very necessary episode that kept the momentum up. And I'm, continuing very much to enjoy the show and the other layers of character development we're getting, particularly with our two leads in Evangeline and Liz. How about you, Grace?
Yeah, I would agree. I like this episode a lot, and I thought actually it maybe has one of the more like moving scenes of Julia and then subsequently like Navarro finding out about her sister and just
Mhm.
the overwhelming tragedy that her and her family have gone through, and then the fight between Danvers and Navarro. I do have one small writing critique about that scene, which we'll get to
Mm.
when we talk about it. That I thought was the first time I was like, oh, it's that didn't jive with me as much. The show really loves the like hey Danvers, are you there? I got really big news. And then cut to big
Uh-huh.
thing happening, which kind of is how we end this week's
Mhm.
episode. Um I'm feel like I'm more confused than ever, which I'm totally fine with. But I feel like in terms of where I thought the show would go was starting supernatural, and slowly we would figure out we'd get sort of like the supernatural explanations, like more,
Mhm.
the ways in which like what are these things, is it culture, is it whatever those things are, while also uncovering more and more about what might be not supernatural, what might be natural that happened.
Mhm.
And I feel like this episode was like, no, it's actually there's so much supernatural happening
Yeah.
in the way we ended the episode, so I'm interested in that balance.
Yeah. I
So
think that the headline here is, and I'm going to spoil the sixth sense, is that, Navarro sees dead people. Like
yeah,
that the seeing of the dead people is very real. And I think that we have a couple of points here to suggest that Navarro is seeing dead people. And the one piece that I think is the most verifiable in terms of the show logic is that Navarro seems to have seen Holden with the polar bear before she was aware that Holden actually had a polar bear stuffed animal.
Yeah, the thing to me that is interesting. I'll give a quick plot recap in a second, but
Mhm.
the fact that Navarro, yeah, is so reluctant to be somebody who's seeing things,
Mhm.
I think is the big thing for me this episode, and that's how where I feel like the ending is so interesting, and the assertion that, so interestingly though, the fact that she might have been seeing people all along, but then also in this conversation with Danvers being so
Mhm.
sure that it will now happen to her, the same thing that happened to her mother
Mhm.
and her sister, that now she will succumb
Mhm.
to what happened, and yet still in that same conversation refusing to acknowledge that she potentially has maybe some of the same thing that's happening with Rose. She's not really being honest, maybe even with Rose too. So,
Yeah.
yeah, let me just give a quick plot recap here, and then we can dive into it. Which is basically Danvers and Navarro, they're continuing to try to figure out what happened at the Salal research station, as well as what happened to Annie. Danvers finds Julia alone, and Navarro checks her into a medical center. Navarro finds out that they go and search Oliver Tagak's house again and find the symbol, and most importantly, a stone with the symbol on it. At night, Julia leaves. Well, it's all night, but Julia leaves the medical center and walks into the sea, ultimately dying. Hank is left at the airport by his bride to be, and Pete leaves Kayla alone on Christmas Eve to provide Evangeline with backup at Oliver's house. Reeling from her sister's death, Navarro gets into a fight with three men and ends up being pretty badly beaten. Danvers narrowly avoids hitting the polar bear with one eye after a drunken fight with Connolly. After a fight about what happened at the Wheeler incident, the two head to the Dredges, where they find Otis, a man with blindness and burst eardrums, similar to what happened to the men at the research station, wearing Ray's coat. Navarro sees a dead woman and appears to fall into some sort of trance. Um, the one piece I guess I would be interested in starting with is Julia also sees, so there's three times this episode where
Mhm.
um one of the Navarro sisters sees somebody. So Julia
Mhm.
sees someone under her bed. Seemingly Navarro sees somebody at the Wheeler incident, although that, happens as Danvers is retelling a story about what Navarro saw.
Mhm.
So who knows how accurate we can take that. And then Navarro sees a woman at the end of the episode. And my question is this the same person? I was having it. There's a cross that we see when Julia
Mhm.
sees the woman under her bed. Um, yeah, I'm wondering basically, yeah, this is, I think, pretty important here that Rose is
Yeah.
saying, don't confuse mental illness with seeing dead people. Dead people come to give you messages. There's all these dead people in Ennis. What's happening here with Navarro, I guess, is
So
the no.
my interpretation of who we see under the bed and who Navarro sees, who Evangeline Navarro sees at the dredge is that Julia sees a woman who's holding a cross under the bed. We also had Navarro find a cross in her car when she was
Right.
driving, which almost led to her accident involving a polar bear.
Right.
I think that that vision is of their mother,
Right.
because we also see the cross in Navarro's remembering of her mother, and we hear the thing about praying, that, Jules plays a lot, that this might have been something that afflicted her mother. I think the woman that Navarro sees at the dredges is actually Jules. And I watched really closely because she sees her twice. She sees her floating in the water. We know that Jules has died by walking into the sea.
Yeah.
Um, it looks like it's blue hair. That's
Right.
that's the that's the hair in the water, and then the woman who's standing in front of her by the Christmas tree very clearly has blue hair. Her face is open in a scream. I
Yeah.
agree, like, it wasn't super clear to me. I wasn't positive who this was at first, but I went and rewound and watched it again, and I'm feeling pretty confident that that's Jules. And so this idea of seeing dead people, what did the dead people want? It seems very clear that Jules was haunted by visions of her mother, that might have been the main, hallucination or vision or whatever you want to call it, that was so distressing to her. And now that Jules is dead, Navarro is kind of inheriting this kind of haunting of by somebody, potentially her own sister. There's also like this really, I mean, there's so much here. There's a lot of like sadness and sort of knowingness in the exchanges between Evangeline and Julia in this episode. Like
Mhm.
when Evangeline comes to get Julia after Liz finds her and eventually takes her to the lighthouse. Jules is, like, very resigned to this is her fate, like, and at some point, Evangeline says, "You knew that this was gonna happen,
Mhm.
didn't you?" Like, Jules seems to know that now I'm going to the lighthouse. When she calls and says goodbye like, says, "I love you"
Yeah.
to Evangeline before she walks out into the sea, that there's something and she also apologizes and says that she's sorry, and it seems like in some ways, maybe Julia knows that she's going to pass over to the other side and that whatever has been afflicting her is going to get transmitted to her sister in this kind of familial chain the way whatever happened to her mother. There seems to be this kind of knowing heaviness about their exchanges that made me wonder if Jules was like very aware of what was happening, what was going to happen, and how this would impact Evangeline.
And I think in the conversation with Navarro and Danvers, I think you can feel that same sort of
Mm,
acceptance in
mhm,
Navarro's words. She's saying like, "This is what happens," and Danvers is trying to say, "No, listen, you're a smart, intelligent woman. You know this doesn't have to be what happens to you." But
mhm,
Navarro seems so sure. And I think where it's interesting is that she's then so adamantly refusing that she saw the woman that Will Wheeler
mhm.
kills. She's so certain that she's adamant or stubborn that she didn't. Um, interestingly, that would be somebody who also was seemingly just killed. And so
Yeah.
the piece that we talked about on the deep dive last week is that also Anders Lund seems to attack her
Mhm,
as soon as he dies. It's almost
mhm,
like or in the middle of dying as he's sort of crossing over, that these seems to be the moments in which people are talking to Evangeline. Um, and yet now this piece might be worse. It's as soon as she, I guess, sees Julia knows now, okay, now I'm haunted by this, that this is where she sort of goes into this trance-like state, or at least is
mm,
staring, sort of
mhm.
sitting by that tree, staring at Danvers by the end of the episode, perhaps a little um, accepting of what she knows now
Yeah.
must be true.
Yeah, it's like it probably is reminiscent to what Danvers had observed when in the Wheeler case, that she kind of locks into some trance and she's seeing something that Danvers can't see. And it's interesting, like to go back to like this, it seems like Evangeline is in this state where she's like starting to come to accept this and maybe starting to open up to Liz about what she's experiencing. Liz is like really hostile to this whole point of view. She tries to convince Evangeline, no, you're like an intelligent woman. Like you can't
Yeah,
believe these things. You're strong. This isn't going to happen to you. So she's really, really pushing back. Um, and maybe the reason that the Wheeler case is something that she's not going to admit to is because some one of these women shot that man. So either Liz or Evangeline shot this man. And if Evangeline said admits to doing it because she saw a dead
exactly.
person. Dead
Right.
people like to point. We know that the pointing is
Yeah,
a
pointing.
thing. We've
Mhm.
got another instance of pointing. Then maybe that like complicates it. Maybe like Liz is covering for her in some way. Like there's another layer of complexity there in terms of Danvers' role as the chief of police and whatever happened that was probably that cops are not supposed to kill somebody in if it's not in self-defense.
Sure.
So that is something that adds a layer of complication, but, I think it's a very interesting dynamic that Evangeline is coming to cope with this, and Liz, because of the tragedies in her own life and her own experience with death, is extremely defensive and hostile to the notion that this could be true.
So the only piece of this that I didn't like in terms of the conversation between Danvers and Navarro is when Navarro finds the polar bear and they're talking about like, you know, y- Liz is like, what are you getting at? Like they're gone. They're gone. And And then it's like, well, why do you keep this thing? It's like, why do you keep stuff that reminds you of the people that passed away?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, I feel like to make the point that Danvers does not believe in anything spiritual, throwing away the polar bear, I was like, no, so I feel like you just keep things that are reminders of the times that you had that you people that
Mhm.
you love. So that's the only part I didn't like. I get why it's in there because I think, she throws the polar bear and she comes back and she goes, there's no one else. We're here, they're gone.
Mhm.
Like it's to serve the point that these two people have very differing viewpoints on the idea of the afterlife and
Mhm.
spirituality and what and who you might, whether or not ghosts exist and whether they visit you and see you, and it's to drive home that point. But I was like, it's more the Navarro writing of like
Yeah.
why do you keep this thing? It's like, why do you keep any memento of something, of anything? It's like to have that memory, and obviously it's also painful, and that's why she hides it in the box. So the only piece that I didn't
Yeah, yeah,
like.
no, I do think that that was, like, probably, like, a little bit of, like, sloppy just so writing. It doesn't, like, really, like, it doesn't have a lot of truth coming from Navarro as a character, but you can see the function that it served. But, like, this idea of it kind of it gets back to this kind of conflict between these 2 women about the idea of prayer and being alone. Like, Evangeline talks a few times, she mentions it to Kavik, and then she also talks about Danvers being alone, but like this idea of being alone and alone in the universe, sort of like
Yeah,
without a god, without a plan, without
yeah,
there being some comfort. And they both share these relationships with prayer when they're driving in the car together, and we get more of Liz's backstory. I mean, I think that the show has done a really deft job, and I have to give, Jodie Foster a lot of credit for keeping this character on this line between being, sympathetic and tragic, and also, somebody who can be a jerk, and we can have both feelings about. Like, she can be like a tyrant at work, she can be mean to everybody, she can be insensitive, she can be probably racist, a bad mother to Leah, but also at the same time somebody who is trying in her own limited way, who's suffered a lot of loss, and we have sympathy for. But they talk about this idea of being alone and praying, and we find out that in addition to losing Holden and Jake, Liz has also lost her mother at a very young age.
yeah. The scene is I really like the scene as well. I like, and it's the way in which Liz is telling one of the most personal stories of her life, and the way Evangeline just immediately sort of makes fun of her, I thought is so
You
true.
didn't
I mean,
pray hard enough. You
maybe
did.
he's just in imperative. The amount of people that she says "f off" to, or "I hate you," or whatever in this episode is many. It's very funny. I want to count it and see if Jess can name off all the people that she bickers with this episode, because I think it's pretty much everybody.
Mhm.
But but yeah, the scene of her yeah, like I prayed to my knees, like I couldn't walk at the funeral. Like I just thought, my dad told me if I just prayed enough, my mom will be fine, and it didn't. Yeah, didn't mean
Yeah.
anything. It says maybe didn't pray hard enough. It's very funny. I
No, these 2 have, like, really good
I agree.
chemistry, and, like, Callie Rez being, like, relatively new to acting, I mean, she
Yeah,
is, like, killing this role. It's, like,
yeah,
so excellent. I love her presence, but it just makes so much sense that these women would, in this odd way, have this connection to each other. I'm going back to the Issa Lopez interview, what's bringing these women together and
yeah,
what's pushing them apart, and I think it's a shared experience of loss and feeling alone. In this episode, Evangeline says to Kavik, "You're alone, I'm alone, Danvers is alone." Like, these are women who in a lot of ways choose to be alone by pushing away anybody who could care about them. Obviously, Evangeline has like this very close relationship with Jules, who she loses, and we know that Danvers has lost people that are close to her. But Kavik, who's like freaking like boyfriend of the year. Like, he gets the SpongeBob toothpaste, like,
so cute,
he's
so
so
cute,
I love the way he pretends he's going to propose to her and then, like,
very funny.
relocates her finger because he knows it's, like, the only way he'll get her off guard enough that she'll let him touch him. I mean, she's so rude to him and, like,
Yeah,
pushes him away all the
yeah,
time, even though she always comes back, always comes back. Um, there's a way that it makes sense that that these two kind of really, really tough women who have a lot of difficulty expressing any vulnerabilities would find a way to get along together. And I thought that like having that scene where she can just mock somebody in this very vulnerable moment was hilarious and really rang true.
Well, there's also a third person who is in her own way alone, but actively chose to be alone, which is Navarro goes to see Rose,
Mhm.
and she's all dressed up, and she's made a full Christmas dinner just for her.
Rose
Just
act like she was mothering hard in this
yeah,
episode in that like
yeah,
that jaunty red cocktail dress
right,
and she made this whole spread.
yeah,
It's not even clear that she was expecting Evangeline or anybody at all.
just Travis, I think.
Yes.
Um, what yeah, so she talks about, like, what did you do before? She was a serious professor in a very serious school writing very serious papers, and one day after coffee, she just realized it's all meaningless. I'm just making noise for the sake of making noise, and so it's so much quieter here, except for all the effing dead. And
Mhm,
so this is somebody who has actively chosen to remove themselves from, um, as much of society kind of as she can, to make a choice to move somewhere where you can live a much quieter life, feeling
mm,
like she's not caught up in the machine of even something that we would argue is important, which is academia. It's like
mhm,
she's like,
mhm.
I don't know, it felt meaning. She calls it meaningless. So it's
Yeah.
just like putting stuff out there, and who cares? And so now I'm here, and that's kind of the scene. That's all we get from
Yeah,
Rose Agony,
yeah.
really. No,
Yeah, I mean, Rose is such a fascinating character, and I think that, like, even though she's been relatively minor in terms of the significant plot points of the series so far, I think that, like, she's carrying a lot of heavy weight thematically. Like, the whole conversation about seeing the dead and that there's the
I
3
know, I
things
keep going back to
that
it. I
dead
know.
people want, like, that seems so important, and here she brings up this notion of noise and quiet, and I have
Yeah.
to say, last episode was the first time I noticed this, and then it was appeared twice in this episode.
I wonder if we have
Liz
the same thing. Yeah.
Liz Danvers
Yeah.
often listens to white noise
Yes.
tracks.
Yes, she does. Yeah, it's on in the beginning of the episode,
Mhm.
and, sometime later, yeah, there's white noise, and so it's whenever she's there, she's like, she can't have the silence.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I definitely think that there's something about this idea of noise and drowning out whatever is happening in Ennis being a quiet place, but maybe that quiet allows you to notice things that you wouldn't notice otherwise, like all the effing dead people.
Mhm.
So the fact that I thought Rose mentioning that in her former life as a serious professor at a serious university, she was just creating noise, I think is very interesting.
Yeah. Um, Liz also she's drinking alone mostly, I think, because Leah has decided to
Mm.
leave and go to the Priors household. We never really talked about the fact that the cops are named Priors. That seems it feels of note.
Yeah, what's your
Well, that Hank
interpretation?
has priors, that Hank is covering
Oh,
I mean, we know
yeah,
from last
yeah.
episode, what's he covering up still, I think?
Mhm. What are
Um,
his prior offenses? Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so what happens here with, like, Liz ending up, like, celebrating Christmas Eve alone with a bottle of vodka is
yeah.
Leah's gotten herself in some trouble with none other than Kate McKintrick, the mining heiress of Ennis, Alaska.
So funny that in this episode, like, it's actually too hard for us to keep track of all the people that Liz has slept with because they go to this guy's house to get maps of
Mhm.
tunnel systems, and it turns out she's also slept with this isn't the teacher, right? This
No,
isn't
it isn't. I think it is the
Oh,
teacher.
okay.
It is the
Okay.
teacher.
Alright, well, there we go. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
but yeah, then the woman, I was like, "Oh, is that Kate?" And I was like, "No, no, wait, no, that's Kate,
Mhm.
McKintrick." Yeah. Um, interesting, yeah, you know, I don't know what to make of this, basically that she's, getting Leah off, and Leah comes out as like, "You always take their side," which is
Mhm.
very much like not totally true, at least the fact that she's trying to make sure that she doesn't get charged with vandalism, basically. And then Leah leaving, but
Mhm.
then also Liz driving drunk, which is literally an offense she arrests someone for and puts in a
Yeah.
drunk tank in episode 1. So the way in which she is just quite a bit of a hypocrite, I think,
Yeah.
is on
Yeah.
show here in this episode. Yeah.
Yeah, the Leah scene I thought was important because it sort of shows how Liz is in a bit of a lose-lose situation because on the one hand, she knows that, like, her daughter is particularly vulnerable because there might be people who are out to get her in this town because of who Liz is, because of her identity, because she's a Native woman, because she's protesting the mines, because she has these beliefs, and, like, Liz is doing in her own way what she can to protect her from those fates.
Yeah.
And like Leah in doing this, it's like, you get why she's doing it. And like I definitely appreciate the moxie and like getting out there and protesting and getting your voice heard. But it's also something that, Danvers is investigating a case of a young woman who looks like Leah who did this and was murdered. And who knows why she was murdered, but we do know that there are a lot of people that were more than happy to see her go. So you can definitely empathize with this fear and protective instinct. Like, you can't let Leah go down this path. But then from Leah's perspective, it feels like her mom is always taking their side because she's getting scolded. She's getting scolded for having this relationship and making this tape. She's getting scolded for protesting. Um, as a parent, like it's tricky to negotiate that. Danvers comes back and she's like, "Well, let's have the turkey and make Thanksgiving." And Leah's really mad and she wants to leave. And you feel bad for Danvers, and then in the next breath she says, "Fine, get out of here. I don't want
I
to see
know.
you anyway." And then you're like, "Oh, but that wasn't great.
I
Like
know.
that's not good
Yeah.
parenting."
Yeah, I'm a little worried that as the tensions and stakes of the show have to rise in the last 2 episodes, that there is a theme of Danvers trying to make sure that something bad doesn't happen to Leah, and it being, I think, a reasonable fear with maybe unreasonable ways of
Mhm.
showing that and trying to stop it from happening. So because like then you get the scene where the three Inupiaq women are all
Mhm.
baking, only to then
And
find out that Danvers is also going to ruin Kayla's Christmas by
mhm.
Pete go with Evangeline. But it's a very nice moment. But yeah, the way in which there's the lingering seed of like protests have been planned
Mhm.
as well, feels like a place where potentially as things are happening also
Mhm.
Leah is in trouble, which I just do not want to see. But
Yeah, there's a huge
yeah.
upside for tragedy here or downside for tragedy, which, would be really, really hard to watch. You interviewed this actress, her name is what is a
Isabella Star LeBlanc, yeah.
Isabelle Charlotte, and I think
Yeah.
she's doing a really excellent job. I mean, there's something that I think is so evocative about the scene with the 3 generations of women baking there in the Pryor home, and of
Yeah.
course, Pete Pryor isn't there, Elizabeth Danvers isn't there, like, the white people don't understand, like, this aspect of what's important to these women in terms of their needs, and they're isolated from that. And Liz is drinking alone and Pete is out working. We later hear Pete talk to Kayla when he finally comes back to bed. "Oh, you're going to say that why don't you just say that I ruined your life and you never wanted to have children?" And that there's like something of this, I don't want to say curse because that's a loaded term, Grace, but like there's something of this, like, to have one of these blended families means that there's always going to be this separation, this piece that is hard to communicate, that isn't understood. And there seems to be this real sadness about that for both Leah and Liz, and then also for Kayla and Pete.
Yeah, and they have a chat in bed, and he basically thinks that she's with him only because she got pregnant and they decided to
Mhm.
stay together. We have that conversation in a previous episode where he says like, you should have known you married a police officer. And she's like, I didn't get, I did,
Mhm.
when you were my boyfriend, you were not a police officer. You then chose to become one. So, yeah, still a lot of tension there. We add in the mix here that Hank is totally being fleeced by his mail
Oh,
order bride.
no, no, Grace, I thought that there was an emergency and she just didn't have cell
Cell
service.
service.
Isn't that what he said? That's what I thought
I was
happened.
kind of obsessed with the show Catfish when it came out, and just the amount
Uh-huh.
of times people can like fall for the of like, yeah, I've never seen them or heard from them or whatever. Is just, and I send them money every week.
Yeah.
Is just,
Ooh.
I don't like it, but I still do think Hank is on my like very suspect list of
Mm.
again being part of. We keep saying this. I don't think he murdered anybody, but I do think he is covering up institutional racism.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean,
With
he's the
Jessica.
right mix of incompetent and corrupt, right,
Yeah,
to let all of this happen.
yeah.
While he still remains like a very unlikable character, I did feel a few pangs of sympathy when he had to take all of the rose petals off of the bed.
When you start, but then I'm like, "Oh, dude, you're just picking them up one by one? Like, scrape
Just
or vacuum or
get a
something?
vacuum,
Yeah,
yeah,
come
yeah.
on, what are you doing, one by one?
Maybe he
You're a
wants to
fool."
save them, keep them nice so he
For
can
the next
really
time when she
yeah.
comes over. Yeah, and I did like the image of both of him and Connolly both watching Elf. I thought was very,
Yeah, yeah.
a classic Christmas movie. Let's talk a little bit about the visit to
Mm.
Connolly because, um, she comes over, she's driven drunk, and then it's,
Don't do
they're
that, kids. Don't
do
drive
not
drunk.
yeah, do not do that. They're she, like, flirtily takes off her socks, and then
Mhm,
very quickly when she starts making fun of him for having, like, the teeth whitener,
mhm,
and she accuses him of moving her because she was a better cop. He admits it, but says, "You're a better cop, but you have no people skills," and it got worse when Jake and Holden died, and that's basically enough for her to leave and
mhm,
drive drunk back home. Um, I think that is important because I feel like the flashbacks we get with her, she
mm,
does have these like a certain set of in terms of I thought for as many times as she says F you or I hate you, she also says that's my boy to Pete when he
mhm.
agrees to go get, and so like there is some sweetness to her, and
She has some
certainly
charm,
with
right.
kids, she's so
Mhm.
good with kids. We've seen it, I think, 3 times in the flashbacks with
Yeah.
Holden, with Darwin, and then the, Susan's daughter, and
Mhm.
so but you can see how just this, like, moment would just make you mad at the world and mad at everybody. So this
Yeah.
was like, it's not much here, but it's certainly enlightening. Oh, and the fact that he's sticking around, seemingly.
And the fact that he's running for mayor, I think, is also probably a significant piece of information that
Very
we get
true.
from this. Yeah, but, just to the point of the fact that, maybe Liz has never been the best people person, but that she does have some innate skills with that have maybe dwindled or gotten, less put into action. Even with Julia in this scene where
Very
Liz
true.
is the one who finds Julia on the street, taking her clothes off, obviously distressed. She definitely has like a very gentle and effective manner of dealing with a sensitive situation and coaxing Julia into the car. So there are these moments where we see that Liz does have the capacity to be very empathetic and very effective. But it's maybe, been calloused over with these like years of pain and suffering, and I definitely what Connolly says kind of lends some credence to the fact that it's gotten worse.
Yeah. Can one thing I said on the feedback show this week that I thought was it's a really effective mechanic that the show is using in which to basically have kind of 2 mysteries, and
Mhm,
they can essentially sort of give us a lot about potentially what happened with Annie and a lot of character development, and basically slow roll the research station
mhm.
mystery. And so this is a pretty big episode, and I want to touch on 2 things here, which is one is that when Julia goes into the sea and ends her life, she folds her clothes. She
Yes.
is not seemingly she is taking off her clothes when she is walking through town, but she's not seemingly folding them. And it's after the orange gets rolled
Mhm.
towards her, as well as and then she's folding her clothes in the end. And then obviously everything that happens here at the end of the episode with Otis and the reveal, and we know that the video, I presume you hear a hatch in the Annie
Mm.
video. So I feel like this is a big, like it's a lot of info, but it's about as much as we get normally. I feel like each week with the
Yeah.
Cell Research Station, in which to say I still don't really know what's happening, I guess.
Yeah, let's take
Yeah.
some time to, like, puzzle
Yeah.
this out, and I hope that, like, we get the grace of being, like,
Yeah.
kind of first at the like, first at crack at this because I haven't had a chance to see what
Yeah.
other people are saying about this episode or really, like, go
That's
over
what
it
the deep
more.
dive's for, is to
Mhm.
that's to be right. This one is to be very speculative
Okay, great,
and
great.
wrong.
It's
Yeah.
not my job to be right. You heard it here first. So yeah, so things that we see like the folding the clothes is very deliberate, and this is the same way that we see the clothes folded from the Salal station. And as you pointed out, we see Jules is also disrobing, but not deliberately. Like she's not folding her clothes and putting them nicely. So maybe that's a different thing. So at least there's the suggestion here that whatever supernatural hallucinatory experience Jules is having that compels her to walk naked into the sea is something like what the Salal research station scientists also experienced. Of course, the death is not the same because she doesn't die of cardiac arrest. She's not terrified. She seems to very calmly walk into the ocean, whereas we can only assume from the faces and the postures of the scientists that they were horrified, like the caribou or whatever.
Yeah. From the video that we see where the power goes out, this is another piece of information we learned that the power goes
Mhm.
out both times
Yeah.
in the videos. That's Raymond Clark, who's in the pink coat, who
Mhm.
was in the back of this man's video. And this has changed things for me in terms there was a lot of theories about the mind poisoning water and whatever. I was actually listening to that like this does have like people unknowingly, this is where people are, dying of cancer, the stillborn
Mhm.
babies in this community. It's because of contaminated water sources and things like that. But the idea that the water is like black, I think is like it's how long was it contaminated before it just finally turned black,
Mhm.
right? Um, but it does seem like to me the evidence would show that there are certain people who have been under similar influences, and this is where I want to try and build connections between what could happen to these people that would not
Mhm.
happen to other people in the town. So Raymond Clark is the one who's saying, she's awake. She's
Mhm.
awake. Anders Lund, there's a similar thing, but he could just be repeating whatever thing Raymond Clark was putting
Mm.
them under, right? When he's saying we woke her, she's awake, that could just because he was lured out by Raymond Clark,
Right.
froze to death, while Raymond Clark
Yeah.
is like, we woke her, she's awake, right? So he's just
Right.
repeating things
Yeah.
as opposed to people who potentially are consciously hearing Navarro, Julia, Raymond Clark, people who are consciously are hearing she's
Mhm.
awake, are having some sort of thing happening to them.
Yeah.
And what connects those people together?
Yeah, that's a really great point because we do have like evidence from the show that it wasn't that the other members of the Salal research station were not like emotionally distressed or having like bizarre perceptual experiences because we see Melina in a very normal way make a TikTok about a
Yeah.
ham sandwich.
We see everybody. They're all walking around the thing until Clark shows up and says she's awake as he's like
Right.
shivering and convulsing, and then the power goes out.
Yeah. So there is like some reason to think that like whatever Clark was experiencing in terms of some kind of psychological unraveling, which is like reported by multiple people, that could be something like what we see in Jules potentially. That doesn't seem to match anything that we saw in Annie per se, but if
No,
Clark was like, and so there could be a connection between those deaths, but it might not be the same cause. I think is fair to say, like, the way
but
that Annie dies might not be the same way that the scientists died.
aren't these people acting this way once someone dies? So Julia is having is this is happening because her mother died, and now
Mm,
she's haunted by her mother. You have Evangeline, who now seemingly has fallen into something similar because Julia has died. It's these people who then it's
mm.
like she calls it a curse, right? She does call. I hope this thing that happens in the finale of the curse. I can't imagine we'll get the same thing,
Oh
but if
my
you know,
gosh, what
you
if it
know.
was the same thing?
I know, it's so hard not to spoil it. And then, but Clark as well. If he knew something happened to Anne, and this has been a theory of mine I had, and that it's
Mm,
less so that they're all poisoned, they all go crazy. It's more so that somebody knows how much bad stuff that they are doing, like Annie was uncovering, and now
Uh-huh.
says, "You're all gonna pay for that. You're all
Mm.
this is," and is Raymond Clark, who, we posit as like the murderer of Annie, but he's
Ah.
eventually, as we saw the pictures that they're together, saying, well, and now he's haunted by Annie, and his revenge is to do it. I don't know that that fully
Ooh,
explains.
I
I mean,
love this.
is she awake? It could be Annie, because he's now seen, like, she died, but now she's awake, right?
But Annie is, like, very important because she is as far as we can tell in this show, is the originator of the spiral.
Correct.
And then this spiral
She
is some
dreamt it, she tattooed it, and then she subsequently has not dreamt it. And then 5 days after she dies, Raymond Clark also gets it tattooed on his
Mhm.
body.
And then if your theory is correct, then Annie's death ends up being the thing that consumes Raymond Clark and maybe marks the change in his personality to being this more kind of solitary. We also, I would just want to point out where this fits is we think that Evangeline and Jules's mother had a similar death of walking out
Yes.
into the Arctic and being and having this kind of unsolved murder like Annie did, and then that is, like, the thing that sort of infects Julia, and then Julia's death might in turn infect Evangeline. I think that this is a very interesting theory, Grace. So now
Mm.
this is maybe a good time to bring in our new character, Otis Heiss, who has similar injuries to the injuries of the Salal station scientist, but has somehow survived this. And subsequent to the incident, seems to have this kind of similarly like dysregulated behavior. It sounds like he's got involved in multiple disorderly conduct charges and possession, and he appears to be a junkie when they find him.
Yes.
Um, so what do we think is his connection? We find out that he's the person who mapped the ice caves as
Yes.
well. So
Yes.
much information in this
There's a
episode,
lot.
Grace.
Yeah, the maps. A small moment when they get the map information, the guy being so flustered that he stands up and hits his head on the lamp above his desk. Just a
I
beautiful,
I
just
loved that. I
small
loved that.
little he's just so flustered as the woman he
It's
slept with.
Christmas Eve, like the
Yeah,
woman he had an affair with
yeah.
shows up.
Navarro, who's just like, you could be intimidated by Navarro, and then
Mhm.
his wife, and so he just like hits his head.
Yeah.
Very, very good.
My husband loved this because he is a tall man and he often stands up and hits his heads on
Uh-huh.
things, so
Uh-huh.
he felt represented here.
Yeah. Just very, very good. I still do think that sacrifice plays some role in
Mhm,
all of this, just in the sense that it's kind of the only way I can understand. Um, well, I can understand Raymond wanting just revenge,
mhm,
but the symbol in season one is so connected to sacrifice,
mhm,
and so uh, it. If we're in cult territory, it just does feel like sacrifice is the way to go.
mhm,
So is Otis a sacrifice for something that went wrong, and he is now just an unwell man that people, Oliver knew him, and Oliver connects him to
mhm.
Raymond, and it looks like also that Raymond is I couldn't tell if there was
He's
either.
hiding in the night country, Grace.
I forgot. So he's not in the dredges. So
Yeah.
right, so he's not wearing the pink coat. There was just a scene where someone runs with a red coat or a pink coat, and I
Mhm.
was thinking whether Raymond and Otis are there, but it must
No.
just be that Otis
Yeah.
is in the dredges. What a good name for a. Also, I don't know what
Yeah.
I wanted to know what the dredges.
I don't know what it at
I
first I
love
thought
this combo as well, where she's like, it used to be this beautiful thing. It feels like it must be a mining thing, and it must have been like, but that's what it feels like. Dredges
yes.
feels like.
And I'll say, like, I looked this up, and at first, like, I thought that they said trenches, but that is, like, a
Cleaning.
natural
Yeah.
topological formation, but it's, like, it's a way of extracting it must be a
Right.
mining technique, so, like, a really
Seems like an
large
apparatus for bringing up objects or mud from a river or seabed, or by scooping or dragging, which, as they're trying to bring back extinct DNA and life, and
yeah.
it's extract like what's under the water of the art, all of that makes sense. But the thing of like, yeah, it was beautiful to watch, but then it's just been left out there to do nothing. And they were like, aren't we all, huh? It's like, but yeah, Oda, it feels like, whatever happened, whatever Raymond does to these men, this is my leading theory, is that
Mhm.
Raymond is involved in doing this thing to those men as some sort of ritual sacrifice. they're
Hmm.
perfect people to be sacrificed because they also perhaps deserve it in his
Yeah.
eyes for having maybe one of them be involved in killing Annie, someone he presumably loved. Um, is this something that somebody else has done? And it happened to Otis at some point too. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, so Otis is involved, Oliver Takak is potentially involved here too. Before we get too far away from the dredges, like, I do wanna kind of just point out that, like, the history of a lot of Alaska and the reason that there's people like Danvers and Pryor and, Kate McKintrick and towns like Ennis, which is a fictional town, is basically because people go to Alaska for these industries of mostly mining. And then we have the
yeah,
scientists who are here extracting things. So it's kind of this tension between the indigenous people who are native to the area being colonized by white people who are there to extract something from the land, to take something from it. And like, so it's very much this sort of exploitative relationship there. And I don't know if we've had a chance to remark on it before, but the US government actually pays people to live in Alaska, to move there, to populate these mining industries. Like, it's a very hard place to live for all of the reasons that we've noticed. And we have these white interlopers who come in from the outside that are buffing up against a native culture that has adapted its ways of life and its whole rhythm to living in this kind of environment. There's also, as has been pointed out, 50% of the town is connected to these industries. These industries become really, really vital for the town operating under a modern capitalist system. So it's a really fascinating tension there that is kind of at the heart of the show. And this idea that, like, extracting these things from the land, that damaging the land, of course, is, one of the drivers of climate change, as well as all of the other global trends. And that also places like Ennis are going to be ground zero for these changes because of the melting of polar ice caps and the changing of the environment. So there's so much rich layering of these themes that comes from the place and the people that this show centers on. And now we have to kind of circle back to what we were talking about. The ice caves, I can only assume that these cave systems exist because of the history of either gold mining or whatever is the current like that they
yeah.
come from this history of mining in Alaska. That's why they're there. And at least the connection that Navarro and Danvers make in this episode is that it must be that Oliver Takak was the person who set up the generator in these caves. It's not clear that they were continuing to be in use. It seems like they were sort of obscure. Navarro didn't know they were there. It took, this science teacher to figure this out. There's whale fossils in there. So I don't know where this is going, but I think that these are the connections that Oliver Takak must have been involved in putting a generator in the caves, that Otis would have mapped the caves, so he would have been an expert on them. That's probably how he got involved in all of this. And for whatever reason, Raymond Clark and Annie were doing something inside these ice caves.
Yeah, I mean, Oliver being at this like remote community that then potentially has also left to go to these like underground uh caves. Yeah, it's I agree. I mean, the for me the piece here, I guess the piece here is like, what do they do there? Because
Mhm.
they did seemingly they just killed all the people at the research station. Like they just did that there. I guess certainly. And then the other piece is that Annie says like, "Oh, I found it." Like she
Mhm.
was clearly on the hunt for what was happening here as well. That feels like it has to tie into the mine in some
Yeah.
way probably. I still think Anders Lund, just because he runs the whole thing and he's the most like named person.
Mhm.
I feel like it kind of maybe sucks that he's he's dead.
He
He's
seemed
off
like
the
a
board.
great guy. Yeah.
Seems so great, but I mean, just in terms of like a shit, right? Like him being sort of getting up to nefarious things that can
Mhm.
happen in a hatch that's hidden away that nobody will ever find, that because he has mind money or whatever,
Yeah.
feels like something, but we
Yeah,
shall see.
we have 2 episodes left of this show. I think that we have to get the episode where we learn more about the connection between the mine and the Salal station, because obviously the Salal station, following the funding, following the science, there's something that they were doing that wasn't the, like, ostensible stated purpose of their reason to be there, and then whatever the mine is doing is going to be connected to that. I mean, I'm just convinced that there has to be a connection between the mine and Salal and what they're doing, and that might elucidate somewhat of how these things all got connected. So I'm waiting to learn more about that. I have to imagine that that's coming in one of the upcoming episodes. I want to point out one more thing though about
Yeah.
the supernatural
Yes, please.
angle and who else is experiencing these phenomenon. And you pointed out, Grace, that Danvers is one of the people who hears she's awake.
I think hears it in a dream. Is that right? She
She
wakes up from a dream with
Yeah.
Holden. Is that right? I'd
She
have to
wakes up
check.
with a dream with Holden, but it's not clear that it's like
The
fully a
same.
dream,
Yes.
or
Yeah,
if
yeah,
she's
yeah, right.
seeing Holden. Like, is
Right.
she, so we know that, like, Rose seeing dead people, I think, is important because Rose is not a native. Like, she's not
Yeah,
in
yeah, yeah.
Yupik.
Yeah.
We find out she's probably like some Harvard professor of linguistics or something. And she ends up here. Um, it would be interesting to know more about what she was a professor of, because that could
I
potentially
know, I wanted that as
be
well.
relevant too.
Yeah.
But so we know that, like, it's not just this spiritual thing that the Inupiaq characters are experiencing here. So could Liz be so defensive and upset about dead people not existing because she herself is haunted by dead people?
Yeah, one of the things that I thought was most interesting about Jodie Foster, her being interviewed on, I believe, the episode 2 official HBO podcast, is how much she says this is Navarro's story. This is not I took this role because it uplifts Evangeline Navarro's
Mhm.
story. It uplifts Kaylee Reese's story. And to that end, I was thinking about that from the perspective in which Jodie Foster, I believe, executive produced the season
Yeah.
as well. So involves more so than just playing Liz Danvers, is the idea that, like, up until then, I think in a traditional show that's Jodie Foster is the lead, which she is the lead, but if we take it from the perspective of what you said in the interview, is that you might have seen glimpses or more to give us a clue that maybe Liz is seeing something that she
Mhm.
doesn't necessarily want to see. And when she throws the polar bear, like, you know, okay. But the fact that we're not, and then being able to reveal that later of like, oh, Liz has also just
Mhm.
and been totally trying to shut that out because she doesn't want to believe because she thinks it's supernatural. The one thing I asked both Sarah and Jess, and I'm interested maybe as a last thought
Mhm.
from you, Amanda, is how will you feel about the and you can't know how you feel about the show until you've seen the whole show. But are you hoping that there is so even for Navarro or these people who've had these like,
Mhm.
are you hoping for an explanation, even if it's like a mental health, is that where because like we kind of can't now know about Julia. We can't really know,
Mhm.
is what she saw real or is it not real? And what is the show trying to tell us about whether that was or wasn't real? Because I keep going back to the fact that Rose says, like, with your sister, like, don't confuse mental health issues with the supernatural. And now that does feel like Navarro has fallen basically into the same thing that's going to happen to Julia. The show is saying, like, I don't know if it's saying, but it's implying that could be
Yeah.
mental health concern, right? So
Well,
how
or
much
could
do
be
you?
both, right? Like, it could, she's like, Julia could have had mental health struggles and also
Yeah,
had
true.
this experience. I mean, and this experience is
And
very upsetting and would probably
yes,
lead you to have some stress and
I
anguish.
I also wonder, I know Rose says, like, "Oh, you have to decipher what they want to tell you." But I also wonder whether if these things can happen, it also maybe changes how those interactions happen or what they feel like, right?
Mhm,
So, and what happened to those people. Like Travis died from he also killed himself because he had cancer.
mhm,
And in a way that's him and Julia basically do kill them, and potentially her mother kill themselves in the same way. But I think that there is something different about the way that Travis would interpret how he was treated by this place, like he's an outsider, as opposed to Julia and Navarro's mother, who she is Inupiaq, and yet this, like, the systems of this place like failed her, right? And
Mhm.
so her death and her appearance in the afterlife is much angrier than Travis's is, who is literally dancing, doing a spiritual
Yeah.
dance, you know? And so and then, like, so Rose has a different relationship with Travis than Julia's having with her mother, and now Navarro is mad. She is so mad, and it's a horrific story that happened. So when she then sees Julia, it's a horror story. When Rose sees Travis, it is a he is coming to visit and to provide her information, right? That she
Yeah.
finds the bodies. Yeah.
Well, that's so I went back to Rose's quote about why the dead visit. Some visit because they miss you. Some need to tell you something you need to hear, and some want to take you with them. You need to know the difference. And it seems like one explanation for people taking these actions that compel them to their death is they're being guided by dead people that want to take them along for the ride.
Right.
So it doesn't seem that that's Travis's motivation, at least when the one time we see him visit Rose, he wanted to tell her something she needed to hear, I guess, or visit because he misses her. Like, he was
I think
pointing
both.
out where the
Yeah.
bodies were.
100%. Yeah. Yeah.
And what, if anything, would Travis, like, want to get involved with all of this for? Like, this is not none of Travis's business
Well,
as
other than
far as
that, he
we can tell.
seemingly has cancer because the mine
Yes.
gave him cancer. But I still
So
think that's
mhm,
relationship is different than somebody who is like Inupiaq and
right.
indigenous to that land, and then that land killing you because it's not the land, it's the mind, the people who use this land for their own capitalistic greed, as opposed to Travis, who is also like a
Right.
settler.
So there's
Yeah.
I mean, but there's like the reason for the message, and then there's also like the valence of the message, or the affect of the messenger. But I do think that Travis is in some way connected to wanting this story to be told. So if this has something to do with Salal and the mine and what's causing cancer and poor health and these other issues in Innis, maybe Travis is in some way a vehicle of that. Holden and Jake seem to be have died in a completely unrelated
Also,
way.
we have not seen Jake at all. We've
We've
only
not
seen
seen Jake at
Holden.
all. He does not miss Danvers. Maybe every time he shows up, she's
Well,
sleeping with somebody else.
I actually wonder if again, we don't know what happened in that incident. We've now seen Liz drive drunk as well, and I
Mhm.
know, like, you know, I don't know what happened, but if I think that if we see like a horror version of who has been dealing with this, but is like, no, I'm gonna shut it out. I never saw that. I think it's probably Jake. She's gonna see,
Mhm.
right? She has these flashbacks of like these tender moments with Holden, but Jake, she's not having. And maybe she actually also is like, if he drove drunk or if he
Yeah.
got in the
You
accident.
know what? It's fascinating to imagine that Danvers was the one who was drunk driving and who was responsible for the accident that killed her husband and her son. That would add a whole other layer to the horror of her life and how miserable and, and callous somebody would have to be to deal with all of that. So I think that that could definitely be interesting, and that the one-eyed polar bear is
Yeah, we
also
haven't talked about the one-eyed polar bear.
that's seemingly not related to, the mines per se, but I wonder if there's I mean, let's take the Holden visions, right? Holden visits Navarro because he needs to tell her something he to tell her something she needs to hear, to tell her to help my mommy. So, this is something that Holden is sending a message. Holden visits Liz, like, if anything, maybe, like, it doesn't seem like Holden has a message for Liz or wants to take her with him. Maybe that's, like, visiting but it's like Liz is
I
also
because of the hue of those, I do view them as like memories, but I definitely could be wrong. But I don't view them in the same way that the ghosts have visited. They do feel, and I know like child ghost maybe is different. You know, I do
but
visit the
Navarro didn't know that they like,
oh,
it
oh,
couldn't
sorry.
that
Holden
could've
Holden visiting Navarro.
yes.
Yes, I do view that one.
That must have
Not
that was a ghost visiting her,
yes,
I
yes,
think, is my
yes, I agree. The other person who is like visiting them is a polar bear, which, symbolism of polar bear, resilience, courage,
Mhm.
continuing on. That is what a polar, it lives in like the harshest climate as well as these people do. So is it some message that's trying to be sent to the two of them, which is
Mhm.
like, I know this is hard, but you have to keep going. Like you have to keep moving forward.
And
That's
I'm
the
gonna do
symbol
that
of a,
by
and
stopping your car.
I'm gonna stand in front of your car. That's right. Almost gonna kill you. But they didn't, and it has one eye, so it's like it's even more resilient. It's even more like it's almost been like it can't see fully, but
It's
it
the
still
same
moves
as the
forward.
stuffy, though. It's like it has to be related to Holden. It's the same as the stuffy.
She married a polar bear. Jake is the polar bear. I figured it out. All right. Well, it's a lot. I think we could keep
It's a
talking about that.
lot.
I think the thing that's I keep saying is like the show is so balanced and rich. Like I feel
Mhm.
like every week I'm like, that was such a good balance of like I know more about the characters. I feel like I know a little bit more about what's happening
Yeah.
with the mystery, or at least I can try to make assumptions and guesses in a very fun way. And I feel like they could be way wrong or way right. And then also there's just so much. They're just giving us the stuff, even to the point of like, yeah, I didn't really think about the mayor, him running for mayor
Mhm.
as a plot beat. And you're so right that it definitely could be like way more important than they suggested
Mhm.
in this episode. So I think this season has been very
Yeah.
good. I'm very excited for more.
Yeah. And I wanna go
Yeah.
to a party at Rose's house.
I know. Invite me for dinner, Rose. Rose Agnew. Great name, by the way. I
It is
don't
a
think we
really
knew
good
her
name.
first
And
name
doesn't
before.
Navarro say, like, "That's not even your real name, is
I know.
it?"
Yeah. Well, she did. I don't think Rose Agnew is her real name. So
Wow.
yeah, very fun.
What a queen.
Yeah. All right. Dr. Minot, what else are you up to? Where can people find you?
Well, I am covering 6 Feet Under, which, you can watch on Netflix, and then you can listen to Ariel and I have the greatest time talking about it. We are in season 2 right now, and you can find, that also on post-show recaps, and as always, you can keep up with everything I'm doing by following me on Twitter/X, where I am at Dr. Amanda R. How about you, Grace?
Aaron and I took a week off last week from movies, but we'd be back this week with Argyle, which
Ooh.
we might need to find somebody who liked Argyle to join us on the podcast. I
Maybe
don't
you should
know.
do maybe you could get Parvati Shallow to do it because she did a promotion for
Did
Argyle.
she? Oh, well, I'll try to get Parvati
Yeah,
on the
get
pod.
she did a
Okay.
Trader/Argyle promotional video I
Wow.
saw on social media.
Argyle is it's better than I thought. I still didn't love it, but we'll talk about
Mhm.
it. Full spoiler recaps. Last week we talked about Griselda, which is the new Sofia Vergara Netflix show about Griselda Blanco. I thought it was actually really good. 6 episodes,
Oh.
worth watching. And the next week we're going to talk about Scavenger's Reign, which came out last year, but bit of a slow TV time and movie time. It's not a lot. Stuff is like starting to air, but not a lot is finished. So we're going to go back to that. It's been really interesting. And yeah, for the rest of True Detective Verge, I'll be with Jess on the deep dive. I believe we'll have a special guest, and then Mike Bloom and LaTonya Starks will be doing the Versus pod. Make sure you subscribe, postshowrecaps.com/true detective, and we will be back next week. Until then, we will be detectiving truly.